Good evening and welcome. My name is Melinda Lang and I'm a senior curatorial assistant at the Whitney Museum. I'm speaking to you today from Edward Hopper's New York, the show behind me, and as a member of the curatorial team of this exhibition, I am thrilled to introduce tonight's program, Hopper on Paper. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the Whitney Museum, which is located in Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral lands of the Lenape. The city that is known today as New York inspired many of Hopper's works, and his life and work there is the subject of our program tonight. The name Manhattan comes from their word Manhatta, meaning island of many hills. Our current site is close to land that was a Lenape fishing and planting site called Sappaquanican, or tobacco field. We acknowledge the displacement of this region's original inhabitants and the Lenape diaspora that exists today. As a museum of American art in a city with vital and diverse communities of Indigenous people, we recognize the historical exclusion of Indigenous artists from the Whitney's collection and program. We are committed to addressing these erasures and honoring the perspectives of Indigenous artists and communities as we work for a more equitable future. I encourage everyone to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous lands from where you're tuning in. Tonight's program is part of a 2-session course organized on the occasion of Edward Hopper's New York, and it offers a behind-the-scenes look at works on paper from the Whitney's extensive holdings by the artist. Each session will dive into Hopper's stylistic, formal, and compositional decisions, as well as the historical context in which the works were created. Edward Hopper's New York charts the artist's enduring fascination with the city through more than 200 paintings, prints, drawings, and watercolors from the Whitney's collection, as well as public and private collections and archival materials. In preparation for the exhibition, we spent significant time studying the artist's drawings and prints in the Sondra Gilman Study Center, a research, storage, and display facility devoted to the museum's collection of works on paper, which includes over 19,000 prints, drawings, and photographs. The Hopper on Paper sessions offer an in-depth discussion of the artist's drawings and prints in the study center. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers, Kim Conaty and Kambui Olujimi. Kim Conaty is the Whitney's Stephen and Anne Ames Curator of Drawings and Prints. Kambui Olujimi is an artist based in New York who works across mediums, including installation, photography, film, and drawings. The session will last for about 40 minutes, and then I will come back to you with Kim Conaty for your questions. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so below. I will select a handful of questions for Kim to answer, and we look forward to the discussion tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, my name is Kim Conaty. I'm the Stephen and Anne Ames Curator of Drawings and Prints at the Whitney, and I'm really thrilled to be joined here today with Kambui Olujimi. Welcome, Kambui.
Good to see you, Kim.
Good to see you too. Yeah. We are here in the Works on Paper Study Center, also known as the Sondra Gilman Center at the Whitney. And it's a really fantastic space where we not only can study works on paper, as you can see we're surrounded right now by some beautiful watercolors, but it's also a place where we store a number of the works on paper in the collection. And one of our favorite things to do here in the study center is to be able to invite artists also to come and look at works of their own that are in our collection. Kambui has some beautiful watercolors in our collection, and also to study works by other artists. So we had a conversation several weeks ago about Hopper, and you were interested in coming in to see some Hopper watercolors. So we had done kind of a first look a little bit ago, and it was really exciting to see all of the things that you were bringing out of the watercolors that, you know, from an art history lens, we don't always think about. And what was that experience like for you?
I mean, for me, it was really exciting because I didn't really know too much of his watercolors. I wasn't that familiar with his watercolor work. I knew his paintings, I knew the New York stuff, and I knew some of the stuff from Cape Cod, from doing a residency up in Cape Cod, but you don't get a chance to just be right on it, you know? And when you're right there with the work, and this is true for any work, you can look in the background, you can see little things like tooth, you can see little things like, pencil marks or eraser marks, or you know, what color really is doing. And so it was exciting. And it was exciting to see there's some we're going to talk about, but those over there, those like early student works I had not known about. I thought those were gems. And then we're going to get into it, but there's a lot of ideas about him sliding in and out of abstraction that I thought was interesting, as well as this kind of pattern play that he does with New York landscape that I think is interesting.
Definitely, definitely. So to give you a brief background of Hopper's watercolors before we dive in and talk about the techniques and materials and the exciting stuff, just wanted to note that the Whitney has a very large collection, in fact, the largest collection of Hopper's works in the entire world, and that is a little over 3,100 works in total. Wow. The majority of those are works on paper, nearly 3,000 of those, in fact. And of that, about 84 are watercolors. So that seems like a fairly small number compared to the large number of works we have in the collection, but in fact, Hopper only made about 300 watercolors total in his career. So we have, you know, close to a third of those holdings here in our collection. And I should also note that when I say, you know, about 300 watercolors, that's really what we would call his mature watercolors, which begin in 1923. We'll come back to that date and the importance of that, but we will also be starting with some of these earlier, his kind of earlier experiments with watercolor that Kambui mentioned, where he's still a student, and also some where he is working on his early illustration career. So we see him kind of using the medium for that reason. So we will now turn to some of those early works to kind of show some of these foundations of Hopper's work there.
Something that I thought was really exciting about seeing those earlier works, especially with you know, the canon or any professional artist, there's this idea that there's only a life in the fine art world. You know, that, you know, they didn't do commercial work, they didn't do illustrations, you know, and we see it with all of the artists, like everybody from Gordon Parks to Andy Warhol, you know, that there was a robust and significant holding in this commercial or vernacular space. So it was great to see what that was.
Definitely, definitely. And that's a good reminder too that in just last week, we were here in the Study Center again. I was joined with our paper conservator, Clara Rojas Sebesta, and we were looking at some of Hopper's prints, as well as some of his drawings. And again, as you're noting, looking at some of these works that were maybe in some cases somewhat lesser known at the time, but really foundational for him as he became the painter that he's best known for today. So we're here with some of Hopper's earliest experiments with watercolor, which would have been made, so these three works would have been made between 1899 and 1906. This would have been really a time that he was a student. He was living still in Nyack, New York, which is a small town on the Hudson, just about 30 miles north of Manhattan. And he was commuting into the city for his art school classes. When he was in art school, although, you know, we think that Hopper probably really aspired to be a painter for his whole life, he began with really the fundamentals. So the classes were really in drawing and also in illustration. So many of the cases when he's doing drawing classes, working from figure studies, and with illustration, watercolor was a pretty common medium to use within that. And so these are three studies kind of in grisaille, so meaning without other color besides more of like a black and white palette, kind of in the gray tones. And he is working on a commercially prepared board with a wove paper on top. And that is probably for simple portability and for the ability to kind of prop paper up to be able to work quickly. These were likely done in a class. So we were kind of interested in seeing how Hopper was playing with this medium in these figure studies early in his career. You were pointing out some neat things in these earlier, Kambui.
Oh, I mean, some of the things that I thought were really interesting was This is before he starts his love affair with grand spaces. So you don't see wide open vistas. You don't see even the abstract space of the rooftops, the rocks. None of that is here. It's almost like a class. But there's, I don't know, I was interested in these because he creates these little narratives with these characters, you know, whether it's the like aged boxer or the like distraught businessman. It's interesting how even in this class there's some life to these things that I don't know, I feel like carry through.
Definitely, and it's neat in looking at these studies. You can also get a sense of the preparation for these works. So with a work like this one here, you see where the pencil lines are still it's a really kind of an unfinished sketch, even as a sketch, and the idea of this kind of the brushy background, which I love, that's sort of an indication of what that space might look like, but the space in these cases, like you're saying, the space in these cases is not the important element. It's really looking at the figure, so it's kind of how to bring out the figure through that.
It's like a pretend space almost.
Yeah.
Like it's like, oh, you know this is a floor. This is
right,
cool.
exactly.
You know this is another horizon line. Or even the way he stacks these. You know. Yeah,
exactly. And this is a really neat study where you see, which you do see in many artists' sketches or in this kind of work, where it's not just one subject. It's really kind of taking advantage of even this very small sheet to bring together many different elements. You also have like a boat on the water, an older woman. So you kind of have these different like sketches. Almost in some case, you know, Hopper loved drawing. Also caricatures as a younger child, and many of those sheets, many of those drawings have kind of layers of different subjects, and the boats, which you imagine also for someone who grew up on the Hudson, really overlooking the Hudson, were a really a common theme and motif in all of those works too.
This is, you know, you start stacking. When you have a sketchbook, you'll start stacking, you know, images on top from different time periods. Oh, you know, I was upstate and then I went and we were on the water and then in the winter time. But then there's also where all the ideas sort of spill out onto one page. And you can see here, this kind of looks like an ocean liner.
It does,
you know,
yeah.
and it's that time where it's, you know, where people are crossing the Atlantic, where it's like the huge voyages are part of the mythos. And again, I feel like that's what he's getting into when he starts painting New York City, you know?
Definitely. And I think one thing that we'll sort of see as we go through from these kind of early foundational sketches to the more mature watercolors is how Hopper handles the medium of watercolor, which, as one of the things that you and I have talked about before, is like really all the choices that one has in a medium like this, which you know very well. Part of that is like what type of paper you're using and how absorptive that is. And so like, is it gonna, do you want the pigment to spread? Do you want it to pool? Do you want it to sink directly into the paper?
Yeah, do you want to work wet? Do you, is time not an issue? Is it the kind of thing where you can lay down your background, walk away, have a sandwich and come back, you know? It depends on, you know, what he's up to, and it'll be really exciting to get into that. Yeah.
Definitely. So we're now shifting a little bit forward in time, just a few years in fact, to a moment around 1906, where Hopper has finished his proper schooling foundation at the New York School of Art, and he's beginning to figure out his career, which early on, as was the case for many artists, that meant not immediately having sold out gallery shows, but rather making a living. And so first what he really did was to begin a career as an illustrator. Some of these works are showing how he's also using the medium of watercolor along with chalk, gouache, and drawing to prepare materials for potential illustration. In some cases, works would have been given directly to a magazine for them to reproduce it as a magazine cover, for example. In other cases, he was often building up his portfolio, so he had something to kind of tote around with him to potential clients. And so one of the things that we're seeing here is also his a use of color, which we really begin to see around this time. And we see that here clearly in this work that was likely made for potential illustration. And you were saying something really interesting about that before, Kambui.
Oh, when we were talking about the type of color that happens. So in these earlier, more like illustrative or commercial works, the type of color is about legibility. It's a kind of contrast where immediately you know what the color is, you know the place, hard edges, like you were saying, and it speaks to the medium, the way, you know, the way the image is going to be received, you know, and so you want to be arresting, you want it to be immediately recognizable, whereas in those later ones, it's about more atmosphere, it's about time shared, spending time, and then a lot of it is this in-between color, this like ricochet of light that happens when you're out on the beach and there's light bouncing off the water and the rock and you know, you get a weird haze. These are very clean and immediate and arresting for different reasons though, but really different than some of the ones we'll look at in a little bit.
Definitely. And you think too of, as you're describing that, like what a potential client wants. They want someone who can create a scene that will immediately be readable for the viewers, that pop of color, as you're saying, that kind of clear color. And then even, you know, this is another example of a work that Hopper was making for advertisements. One of the companies that he made a number of advertisements for was for men's suspenders. So this is, it's kind of incredible. And there are, we do have this is an example of one where we do have the sort of the final printed ads that ran in magazines. And so we have him preparing this here, which it's very similar to the sort of early figure studies, and he's working again in this grisaille. He's also adding some white chalk, which was a way to kind of pick up highlights of color, and that was often used and is often seen as sort of an indication in a lot of Hopper's works at this time that are kind of between illustration, as something that was likely made as a preparation for illustration.
These are adding that at the very end?
I think so. Yeah, that's what it appears to be, because you sort of see it on the top of the figure, and you can see also in this, as we saw in some of the other works, all of the additional the pentimenti, the lines that show where the artist had initially made their mark, and you can see he's kind of moving the pose of this figure around to get this very kind of dramatic pose from the back with the suspenders hanging along the side. This one we were talking about earlier is just like this really, there's almost something comedic about it. It's a very strange scene.
It's pretty zany.
Yes,
you know? It's
yes,
like you have the guy hanging out the window. This person is basically tearing up the telephone pole, even though it wasn't a telephone pole yet. Yes.
But it's like telephone pole is something that you see in a lot of Hopper's works, in his paintings, in the watercolors, where the simplicity of adding a telephone pole into a scene was a way of showing kind of this collision of nature and like the man-made environment. Mm-hmm. And it's just very funny to see that here. This is kind of right, like front and center with someone hanging all alongside of it.
You can see in these a lot of those, what we'll see in those mature works. You have the rooftops, you have the sort of guts of a city, whether it's the flutes from all the chimneys, or the infrastructure, which is a huge sub theme, you know, all of those kinds of workings of a city that we don't talk about, but is part of that magic of the turn of the century, at least I imagine.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now we are back looking at Hopper's more mature watercolors, as we call them, and we're really starting in the year 1923, which is a date I mentioned quickly earlier, and that is it was a very important summer for Hopper for many reasons. He was spending the summer in Gloucester, Massachusetts, which is on coastal Massachusetts, as he often did, as many artists did during that time, leave New York during the summers and go to different artist residencies. And while he was in Gloucester, he met Josephine Nivison, who would soon, the next year, become Josephine Nivison Hopper, his wife. She was an artist as well and was a really accomplished watercolorist. So what I think many historians would say is that she's a real reason why he began working in watercolor as kind of as a key medium very much that summer and for several years afterwards. This watercolor here is one that he made this first summer in 1923 in Gloucester. And one of the things that I really love that he has said about his time in Gloucester painting with watercolor was that he was there with many other artists, and many were traveling to the coast and looking out at the water and looking out at the boats and using that as their subjects. And he just kept looking inward, back at the island, back at the dormers, at the buildings. That was really what kind of was drawing his attention. This is like a perfect example of that. And we also have in this composition one of these great sort of Hopper diagonals that you begin to see. He's also using this in his prints as well, this idea of kind of wrapping around the corners, kind of mist around the corner. Here we have that.
Yeah, it's like a little snaking.
Also the electrical poles, and we start to have this kind of these elements, these intrusions of the man-made environment in these watercolors. And it's shortly after that when he and Josephine marry in 1924, and they are now back in New York together. And Hopper, for a short time, for just really a handful of years, also makes watercolors in New York. He only in total made 10 watercolors in New York. So if you imagine, that's a very, very small percentage of his total watercolors. And it seems like it was because it was a medium that he often did in plein air, outside, on site. And in New York, he was often working in his studio. So it was sort of a different type of process. But he continued to use watercolor throughout his career, often in his travels. So if he's traveling to Maine or various places, it became kind of the portable studio. And so one of the things we wanted to look at closely with these three watercolors to start is this kind of the urban landscape, or the sort of the sense of the built environment that Hopper is capturing in his watercolor. Maybe I can turn it over to you, Kambui, for some of your always astute observations with these.
I mean, this is so many different things that jump out to me about Hopper's watercolors, especially this earlier one, which you'll see a lot, this kind of play. Like, it's just really playful. So you have here this like purple shadow that is out of nowhere in some ways. And I love that there's always a little bit more. Because it's not truly, to me, as a city kid, it's not so much an urban space, but this in between. Like, it's not nature, it's a built environment, but it mimics nature, and there's always this hint of like a little bit more that you can't see. You see it a lot in his works, and we'll see it in some of the other ones in Cape Cod, in Maine as well. And then just like some of the stuff that I really love is like in this one, just like letting the original pencil mark live as the line. So it moves in between being a draft mark, like, oh, I'm just trying to figure out where this is gonna go, to being a finishing mark. And that's just a design, like, that's just a designation. This doesn't change its integrity. But it's a really beautiful moment, because to me, it's him playing. And I wonder how it compares to his oil paintings. As a viewer, I always see those as being more labored, more intense and like a little more rigid. Whereas these watercolors, there's a playfulness. You made the line, it's like, I'm gonna let it live like that. It's bleeding down, let it go. And there's a speed, and right here you have this like little, we were talking about it like a little gnome or a little, it changes every time. But it almost looks like a doodle, and that being buried, because you don't see it at this, you get like this far away, 7 feet away from it, you can't really see it, but when you get up on it, there's all these like little, what are they called? Little, I don't know, Easter eggs, thank you. I was gonna say Pokemon. But yeah, all these little Easter eggs, when you get up close to them, you can see.
Definitely. I mean, one thing that you're saying that's really interesting, and that we're not seeing here because we're looking specifically at the watercolors, not with the paintings right with it, is that with the paintings do often have a much, it's a slower process altogether, and it's really a process that he did in the studio. So as we had looked at last week, in fact, with the sketches, the drawing sketches for the paintings, that's where, those drawings are where like the quick spontaneous work happens, but then by the time he's at the easel, it's usually or often about a month long process for him that really building up from the original drawing to the layers below. It's a very long kind of tedious process, whereas the watercolors are ones that he would sometimes return to it a day later. It wasn't always done wholly in one sitting, but he's doing these, there's a critical difference between him working on site and working in the studio. So there's also a lot of imaginative elements that we also talked about last week in the paintings that flow in. So, he's getting glimpses from this, glimpses from that, but then he's able to improvise and synthesize all of those together into a composition that works for a painting. The watercolor, it really is what it is. And I love that you're pointing out this, where he leaves the pencil line in some cases as the sort of final line, as sort of part of the composition. And there is something with a lot of Hopper's work, paintings included, where you do feel like there's sort of an invitation to the viewer. There's something like, even when the paintings are very finished materially, there's often an openness in the composition or a strangeness, something that is almost asking the viewer to fill in something or to maybe acknowledge that the viewer can read it, that this is enough, like taking away detail, etc. And in this case, those pencil lines were enough that you can fill that in.
You can see them knock down whole buildings just into shape. And this is that dance with abstraction that you see in some of the other ones. He's just I'll take this down, I'll take that, and just gives you these gestures. You don't need, to know every building, every window. It's just a mood. And also the color differential, this is just all gonna go cool. And we're gonna pull this red brick building that kind of looks like it's just a distorted building. I can't imagine what it is. 2 years later, it's gone, falls down. But yeah, just if the color shift, where it's the cool is gonna jump back, and then all of the red building and this little bit of warm over here is gonna jump out forward. Again, talking about what you're saying, where it's just this is enough. This you get it,
Yeah, definitely. And so, one of the things that we didn't talk about in detail before is that one of the things that we're doing now is we are preparing for this exhibition on Edward Hopper's New York that opens in October. And so thinking about these New York watercolors become particularly interesting to think about how he used this medium in this city and what those look like. And the Manhattan Bridge, as he's depicting here, is interestingly a really popular motif for him. It's one he goes back to multiple times. He makes one large-scale painting of the bridge.
That's at the beginning, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then 3 other watercolors also capturing the Manhattan Bridge. So it would have been walkable distance from where he lived. He lived in Washington Square. So not 5 minutes away, but let's say a 25, 30 minute walk.
All the time.
Yeah, no big deal. And he clearly was fascinated by this. And one thing that I also kind of love about thinking about the Manhattan Bridge and Hopper is that, when you're walking down to that area and you're in New York, the Manhattan Bridge is basically here, connecting downtown Manhattan to downtown Brooklyn. The Brooklyn Bridge is right next to it. It's really very parallel. But he never paints the Brooklyn Bridge. You don't have any sketches, you don't have any watercolors, nothing. And that was, of course, like the popular icon that so many artists wanted to depict. And there does always feels to me like this almost like literal and figurative turning his back on the Brooklyn Bridge to become this fascinated by the Manhattan Bridge, which was really like built to just as a workhorse bridge that had to carry all the traffic back and forth between the boroughs when the Brooklyn Bridge clearly couldn't do that.
It's kind of like this, like he wants the thing that nobody else has.
Yeah.
He's like, oh, everybody's looking at the Brooklyn Bridge. It's the legend, it's what we came for, what's around the corner.
Yeah.
I'm a New Yorker, and I used to walk with my mom and my big brother and my sisters all over the bridges. And so you would get an affinity. There was a period where we loved the Manhattan Bridge because it was a newer one, because it had color. It was like a steel bridge. It's like kind of amazing. I wonder what the sort of inflections and connotations of the two bridges. Like, you were saying it's a workhorse bridge, which makes a lot of sense. In that painting that he makes of it when it first opens, there's a lot of things that in my life didn't exist on it. Like, it looked very different. And I wonder how it compared in real time to the Brooklyn Bridge.
Definitely. And for the other area that he made most of his New York watercolors, again, there are only 10 total. So he made a few around the Manhattan Bridge, and then 5 were made from his rooftop. So you can imagine, which is another kind of interesting place if you're imagining this idea of painting outdoors, outside the studio. He's kind of at the studio, but he's on the 4th floor walk up in his building. And he had a direct staircase through the hallway up to the roof. So he could go up there. This is not a fancy Manhattan rooftop. It's the sort of the raw New York rooftop that I think many of us have experienced as well. And he noticed that as an interesting studio space also. And he could bring his watercolors up there and paint directly. So that's sort of what we're capturing here. This would have been, we think, because this is actually, you can tell by the windows, he's capturing the actual buildings, the actual structures that were there, many of which are still there today. And so this would have been from his rooftop looking east. And of the other rooftop watercolors capture sort of different angles from the roof. But you were also talking about the types of elements that one sees on the roof, which is totally, I think, in keeping with a lot of Hopper's ideas.
Yeah, I mean, again, growing up, the water towers was so essential. Like it's kind of like a giant. Like, as a kid, you can make up stories about these giant, like, houses. They're like house-size, vessels on top of a big building, and they were all over the city. And it was really iconic, especially at this time, and then you see all of the chimneys and the flutes for that, as well as like that just plumbing stuff. But you can see here, he's like leaving it open, A lot of this is just, it's this dance between it being really accurate, like these are the sort of structural elements with play. Again, you have this like orange kicker that's all down here against this like really vibrant blue, that probably would never exist. But these seem way more fun, like to make. And I'm also interested in the time, like how wet some of when you have a lot of water in watercolor, it lessens the pigment, and so the stroke becomes a little bit more transparent. And so he's making, he's laying down a layer and then working wet over top, and then coming back with these like really sharp lines sometimes, or even dry. Like you can see how dry some of these are. it's a lot of fun, and especially with the paper. We were talking about this earlier, like how toothy the paper is. You know, when you're working dry, you really see that.
Yeah, I think a lot about how these watercolors must have been really important for his formulation of capturing light, and that the transparency enabled by the watercolor medium could do so in a way that he could really play with that, and then find ways of translating that. I mean, that's such the aspect of his painting that he's so known for, is how he's capturing light through oil on canvas. But it does feel like so much of the watercolor is a great like warm up to that in some way.
I mean, I think it's just a more immediate. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have to wait for all the layers. You can lay it down. I had a friend one time, he makes fun of me because he says that I'm impatient sometimes. And I was saying, you know, he called me and we were talking on the phone. I'm like, yeah, man, I'm just waiting for this paint, this watercolor to dry. It's taking forever. And he was like, you know, that's kind of the Formula One of painting, right? Like, you know, it's like, all right. So there's a way that you can do 4 layers, especially if you're outside and it's a sunny day, it'll dry right there. And so it's exciting. You know, I was looking at some of these other ones where you can really see this transparency over, you know, like you look from far away and it's, maybe it's green, maybe it's blue. Then you get up on it, you can see the ochre, you can see the orange underneath, there's like, you know, 4 browns. It doesn't really use that much black.
No, it's interesting. The shadow in a lot of Hopper's, both the watercolors and in a number of the paintings, he loves this blue. That blue ends up being a color that's often used for shadow, or, you know, in place of a black.
I think it softens everything a little bit, especially against those illustrations, which is a lot of black, hard edges, cross-hatching. There's a softness, and you kind of can sink into the color. Again, I think that's one of the things that happens so differently in these two.
I mean, this is interesting to sort of, as we're moving down the line here and moving from these, you know, this small group of these kind of more urban landscapes from the 20s, still within that same time period where he's continuing to leave the city. So he does return to Gloucester other summers, but he also goes to Maine. A number of the next watercolors we'll be looking at are watercolors that he made in Maine in the sort of the mid 1920s. And to get a sense of how he's sort of here, you know, here it's like the overlapping stacking of buildings, and here the rocks in some way sort of replace that. You were remarking earlier about how almost surprising it is to see a composition of Hopper's that's really focused just on these rock formations without anything else. And I was mentioning that there was a period in Hopper's kind of earlier painting career around 1914 where he spent also some summers in Maine, and he made a number of these, we almost call them oil sketches. They're paintings, but on panel and quite small. And they were done on Monhegan Island in Maine, and they're almost completely just the rock formations and the sea. And it's this kind of fascinating moment of abstraction, as you were noting with these rock formations, that it feels like this watercolor always feels to me like a bit of a return to that, which is interesting, something he's kind of played out, in that case, first in oil on panel, and then returns to in watercolor that's so much more luminous. The oil on panel sketches, as you can imagine, are much kind of more layered color, a little bit deeper, just you're not getting the brightness that you're getting in the watercolor.
Yeah. There's no one ever gonna say to you, oh, this rock doesn't look like a rock. You know? Yeah, you wanna check out those?
Let's do it. Okay, so now we are looking at a sort of final group of watercolors that date from still the mid-1920s through 1934. And we'll be looking still at some of these Maine watercolors that Hopper made. This first watercolor is a really beautiful, work that is titled Light at Two Lights, after the Two Lights Lighthouse in Cape Elizabeth, Maine. Interestingly, it's a site he returns to several times, so there are many watercolors he makes around the lighthouse and also around the landscape around that, one of which we'll see in a moment, in fact. But I think this is a great example also of, we've seen how Hopper has in other watercolors and kind of talked about in the paintings different ways that he'll focus in on a scene and kind of have this really kind of dramatic cropping, or he's bringing out the part of the composition that he really wants you to see. And this is, I think, a great example of that with the lighthouse itself. If you imagine so many times when artists painted a lighthouse, it was always about the beacon and about the sort of seeing that it's the sky, and here he just takes that right out of the picture, and you're here, it becomes human scale. It becomes as if you are standing here with him and looking straight out at it. And we're also talking about his use of transparency here, and I'll turn this back to you too.
Yeah, just to riff on what you were saying before, earlier Kim was talking about this cropping, but at a distance, it is a lighthouse. At a distance, there's a certain gratification that you get when you look at a vista, and that's what they're meant to be in those paintings, in the construction of a landscape. And here, this is just what it actually is. Like there's often this denial of your expectations in these paintings, and I don't think that it's just, oh, we're not going to give you what you want. This is what it really is when you're there. And there's something really wonderful about what it actually is beyond the moment of like coming around and seeing it in the grand landscape.
Yeah. You could almost picture that scene when you go to a lighthouse at the end of a point somewhere, and everyone is like backing up with their cameras to try to capture the whole thing. And it's sort of what you're saying. It's like, what if you just capture what's there in front of you? Yeah.
And it's the thing that makes it like the beacon is the thing that makes it a lighthouse. So otherwise it's just a circular building. And so I think there's something about interrogating architecture that happens a lot in this. Like, what are all the parts, I think? Whether it's the water towers, whether it's the pipes, like what are all of the things behind it? What is it really doing? But yeah, transparency is something that you can see all in the grass. Like, he's got a yellow, he's got, 4 different greens at least. Same thing with opacity. There's an opacity play where this is really, really, thick and opaque, but this is super transparent and layered up. And there's even like some red that happens down here. And you can see it for sure here with the rainbow rocks. Like it's like literally a rainbow here, and you have your lavender. There's a way in which it's built up, like to give you an effect that's both 3-dimensional, but also leaving you. Like you can't really sit on a color. When you're seeing, you can't sit and say, this is the color and this is the only color of this.
I mean, you were mentioning earlier today when we were standing further across the room from where we are right now, how this particular, this is going to be your phrase now, the rainbow rocks, Hopper's rainbow rocks, how they change color. You're actually, as the light conditions in the room change, you're noticing the color. So that is absolutely coming from all these transparent layers together that are allowing the light to bounce in different ways, and it really does create a very dynamic, which is sort of also that experience of being there. How do you capture that, that dynamism of having the light, the coastal light, the wind, all of this? It has this sort of, that he's able to capture that in some way.
The rocks are really alive. Like you know, it's like a yellow that moves into a lavender, pink that moves into a blue. So they're shifting, their colors shifting. There's a motion, like they're in movement. The cars seem secondary. Like here you can see the outline for the automobile that got changed, where he just decided to knock it down and make it a minor figure and really give the sort of podium or the highlight the rocks and the sky. Like the sky is, I mean, it's like a Thunderbird. It's like those Thunderbird that were on fire in the 80s on top of the cars. Yes. But you had pointed something out about the skies earlier with all of these.
Yeah, that they're, I mean, if you just looking at these 4 watercolors alone, you can really see that for Hopper, the sky is not a given, that it's very much about a particular day, a particular time, that it's very much capturing a feeling of, and you also, you know, if you think about being in any coastal place, that the sky is constantly changing. So however he's capturing a cloud formation, it does have a sense of the momentary, of this like glimpse. And I love that this is this more, almost, this feels kind of filled in, like this very sort of simple blue, but that's what the sky looks like sometimes. You know, it is sometimes this very pure, straight, almost flat feeling blue to all of these other, you know, attempts at that, whether it's more of the lighter wash or.
But he even does these like bars that go across on this flat wine,
yeah,
which is kind of odd because it feels so like mechanical, but it's a rhythm with it's in rhythm with the paneling, with the aluminum paneling. It's
and the shadow.
And then you have this like this Thunderbird hood, which is amazing. Yeah, and then you still have this kind of tranquil sky that's against these, again, kind of rainbow rocks that are like in motion or really vibrating, you know, vibrating with color.
And this is a scene that was painted, this is also in that same area in Cape Elizabeth, Maine, around the Two Lights lighthouse. So you can see here the beginnings of where there are some structures. So you imagine that the Two Lights lighthouse is right up in this same area, but he's really, this is 2 years later, 2 years after the other watercolor of Two Lights. So it's definitely a place kind of like the Manhattan Bridge where he comes back to. He notices not just the architectural structures, but also these rock formations around that, this kind of, this bay that's created. You also pointed out, Kambui, something quite wonderful about these 2 watercolors as these almost parallel compositions earlier.
Yeah.
With the formation of kind of having these, you know, the boat in here, the cars in here, but also the sense of this kind of sloping landscape.
Also, the pieces of humanity or the built world always fall back and get swallowed up by the natural environment, whether it's the cars being subordinate, whether it's this little boat and this tiny house, and the, you know, dinghy that sort of not dinghy, mooring.
Probably, yeah, mooring, yeah.
Or buoy that just disappears. You know, it's almost put there as for us to remind ourselves of perspective or insignificance.
This last watercolor here is one that Hopper made in 1934. So it was around that time, in fact, that exact year, that after going back to Truro on Cape Cod for a few years, starting in 1930, in 1934, they move into a studio and home there, where they return to most summers thereafter. So that's, you know, about 30 years that they'll spend in that studio. And that was a place where they had a proper studio indoors, and Hopper made a number of his oil paintings there as well as in his New York studio. But he also continued to make watercolors there. So this is a watercolor called House at Pemmon River, and it shows, we were talking this a little bit before, it shows a bit of a change in the approach to the watercolor medium. So first you were noticing the paper itself, which is much toothier. And
really, really rough, yeah.
And it will have a way of being a bit more absorptive, and also he's working very, very dry in these watercolors. He's getting kind of crisper edges, really focusing on, there's a certain stillness in this composition, which is almost feels anathema to the last ones we just looked at that were much more kind of atmospheric and about the rainbow rocks and the quality of light. And here, this definitely feels like a frozen moment. You don't have any sense of of movement.
Yeah.
You have a sense there's a tractor here, but it doesn't feel like something that has moved in some time. The shutters are closed. Everything is very still. And we still have this wonderful, it's amazing you have this kind of rendered composition. You still have this perfect little chimney up there with its little pencil lines that connect it. But there was a moment shortly after this time where Hopper began making fewer watercolors, let's say. Mm-hmm. And when he was asked about that at some point, he really pinned this down to a change in his painting, in his approach to his painting career, which was that he earlier on in his paintings, he had often worked what he called, again, from the fact, through working with drawings, working from nature, and then improvising and synthesizing back in the studio. But then by later in the 30s and the 40s for certain, much more of the process was just kind of through memory and through his own imagination. Mm-hmm. And he talks about his kind of shifting away from watercolor at the same time that his painting is shifting more towards memory and imagination and less focused on working from nature or from the fact. He still is making watercolors in the later period, but it's just it definitely like dwindles. Mm-hmm. And this sort of feels like more of the kind of the end of the high moment.
Yeah, the stillness, I feel like the motion in this comes from nature. Like this is that same sort of vibration with the transparency, where you can see him working wet and letting it drip down, and really quick little motions down here. But if you look at the rocks, in those, there's a vibration. There's like a frequency, and it's a frequency to an inanimate object. The rhythm in this doesn't come from the frequency of nature. It comes from a formal sort of interplay, like all of these triangles that drop down, all of these diagonals, all of the cross-hatching of the shingles. That's where the sort of vibrancy in the image comes from. But it's really odd because it's attributed to a built environment, whereas in the past, that kind of energy, or at least in these, is attributed to a natural space, whether it's the grass, the rocks, the ocean. So that was the one that made me feel a little like, this one's kind of doing its own thing. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to hear Kim talk about how this is near the end of these.
That sort of high moment of the watercolors. And I think, we're really looking at only a handful of places that Hopper made these watercolors. I mentioned earlier, this was also a way that he kind of created his portable studio. So even after Edward and Josephine bought and moved into this home and studio in Truro and Cape Cod, they did still like their road trips. Mm-hmm. They liked to get in the car and drive across the country. They drove to Mexico a couple of times.
That's a slow one. That's a slow one in 1930.
It is. And so the watercolors are a really wonderful way of seeing Hopper actually out in the world in a way that we don't necessarily see in most of the paintings, which are sometimes of New York or loosely of New York, and in other cases, very much these more ambiguous places, like without, he's not saying like, this is the, like the church in Iowa. It's not specific like that. He's moved away from that. But the watercolors, you do definitely see that. And you see him capturing some of these same ideas like rooftops in Saltillo in Mexico, for example. So this is one grouping of the watercolors, but there's plenty more to see in Hopper's watercolors for certain.
Nice. Thank you so much, Kim, for having me down here. It was a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thank you for coming. It has been so fun to be here with these works by Hopper now on a couple occasions. I'm looking forward to the next times. And we do love having artists in the study center. You can simply make an appointment online and come view any number of works that we have here. 14,000 works on paper in this room alone.
Do it. Do it.
Do it. You hear Kambui.
I'm coming back. I might even see you here.
Exactly.
I'm serious.
Exactly. We'll be waiting.
All right. Take care.
Thanks, you too.
Thank you all for joining us for the Q&A. I'm here in Edward Hopper's New York, the exhibition with Kim. We're now going to answer some of your questions. So I see that we have a couple questions about the role of watercolors in Hopper's overall practice. Kim, could you answer, here's a two-part question. Did Hopper ever make preparatory drawings for his watercolors or use watercolors as studies for oil paintings? And did he ever create watercolors with the intention of selling them, or were they all studies?
That is a great set of questions, and we could certainly look at the first part of that. He really didn't seem to have made sketches before the watercolors. And I think we can say that because we see so much of that sketching, that kind of pencil sketching, that line in many of the watercolors. So it feels as if he is drawing the composition on the sheet and then working it through with watercolor following that. And sometimes, as Kambui was pointing out, sometimes letting that line from the compositional sketch be the final line that we see in the watercolor, actually creating form in the composition. He did not ever make use watercolor to make preparatory sketches for his paintings. He did sometimes make watercolors of the same sites that he would then return to in his paintings. And I think the Manhattan Bridge is a great example of that, where we have, 4 watercolors that he made of or from Manhattan Bridge, and then a painting of Manhattan Bridge from 1928, around that same time, but never made in direct relationship to one another. The second part of the question about whether he made his watercolors to sell, or I guess I'll sort of rephrase that, if that's okay, as like maybe to show or to display or as like final works. It does not seem that he was making watercolor as something simply to hold on to, but very much as a final work, as something that he wanted to show, to display, to exhibit. And they did sell. I think one thing that's interesting is that, and we mentioned this a bit earlier in the program, but that it was through watercolor that he gained a lot of early recognition that would really propel his painting career. And that it was his first solo exhibition at his longtime gallery, Frank Wren, was a show of watercolors, which sold out completely. So exactly. Great.
Okay, so we have another question about Hopper's watercolor setup and tools, like what kind of materials he was using. I'm going to read the question. Do any of his original painting materials exist? Brushes, watercolors, cases for carrying the materials around? What would his on-site watercolor setup look like?
This is another great question, and one that we only have some information about. So we do know a bit more about his painting setup, and that is largely because the easel, the sort of custom built easel that he used throughout his mature career is still today in his former Washington Square studio. So that we know is sort of a traditional easel. There are some of his early cases of paint that exist and that will be on display shortly at the Edward Hopper House and Museum in Nyack, New York, which is Hopper's childhood home. And they have an exhibition opening shortly about Hopper's boyhood. So there's a great opportunity to see some of that material there. We also know from one watercolor that Edward made of his wife Josephine, making a watercolor called Joe in Wyoming, that typically when they were kind of on the move, that they would have, meaning when they were making watercolors when they were traveling, they likely kind of set up just working with paper on kind of watercolor on board, so that it was easily transportable. But I wish we did know a little bit more detail about all of that.
Yeah, no, and it'd be exciting to see it and to see the set in Nyack. So moving on to other questions, we have so many fantastic questions here. Did Hopper typically return to the same site or general location to make, like, a series of watercolors, or did he look ahead to different sites each time he wanted to create a new watercolor, a different subject each time, or was it maybe more of like a series at one location?
Another great question. So I don't know that I would describe them as a series in a particular location, but we do see him returning often to the same site. He's also exploring new sites very often, but I think of, the Manhattan Bridge, of course, is just one example we already mentioned. And then when he is making watercolors in Maine, for example, we know that he returned many times to Two Lights in Cape Elizabeth. And what's interesting is that most of those watercolors he made there, you wouldn't necessarily know it was from the same site, because he's always taking a slightly different point of view, a slightly different perspective. So something about certain sites seemed to continue to capture his imagination and allow him to come back more than once and yet render very different compositions.
That's interesting that you wouldn't necessarily recognize it from those different angles, as you said. Another audience member, Britta, I'm going to read this question again, has made a great observation that Hopper's works tend to have aspects that are simultaneously very detailed and then more flat, kind of unfinished, vague areas. Was this unfinished quality just enough, for Hopper? Was this more of an intentional part of his style, or this combination of focused and unfocused, or reality contrasted with memory and fantasy? Was that all intentional? And if so, did he say more about why he was working that way?
Britta, I think you have summed a lot of that up very well with your question, in fact. I think that, I always think back to something that one of Hopper's friends and fellow artists said of his work early in his career, that Hopper's liberties are his omissions, and that he was often working in a way almost kind of designing with an eraser, this idea of giving you what you need in order to also allow for the viewer to fill in the blanks in some way. And I think that's certainly true in the watercolors. I think that's certainly true in the paintings, and this idea. And the more you look at his work from that perspective, I think there's a lot more that we can bring to it. There's a way that the works will often crystallize very beautifully into one unified whole. But looking closely, you see that your eye is actually filling in a lot of that detail. And what we have of him, writing about that or talking about that, I would say we do have him writing about that in some of his journals from the late 40s, early 50s, we think, where he is talking about this kind of, straddling reality and fantasy, and a real interest in not invention, but in imagination, and how one could really infuse real spaces with one's imagination.
So great. I'm going to end with one more question. I think we have just enough time. I'm going to combine a couple here. So Bernard asks, does Hopper include people in any of his watercolors? Very good question. And Jason is asking a bit more about the settings and if there's any similarities between these landscapes, kind of countryside scenes and his urban city watercolors.
Okay. So maybe I will look at the first question. This was a great one about whether Hopper includes figures in his watercolors, because I think many people are familiar with how he includes figures in the paintings. In many of the paintings, I should say. The watercolors are a bit different, in fact. We see very, very few figures. And in fact, the vast majority of examples that have figures are Josephine. And not Josephine, his wife, posing as a figure as she did really throughout all of his paintings, and never being kind of herself in the final painting, but really standing in as a figure, but rather Joe. So Joe reclining, Joe reading. We have these, or Joe in Wyoming, her making watercolors on their trip to the Tetons. And otherwise, we really have, there are a handful of examples of figures in watercolors, but the vast majority are unpeopled in that way. The second question is a great one, also about looking at the sort of urban watercolors. Is this my understanding? Okay, urban watercolors in relation to watercolors, kind of compositions that Hopper is making outside of the city or in the countryside, and if there are these similarities. I think that it almost feels that there's something in the sort of open spaces that Hopper might find out in Truro near their home and studio there. This is in Cape Cod, very open, very kind of rural, remote, that might have almost felt too open for Hopper. So we very often have him capturing, if you have this kind of sweeping view of nature, you so often also have a sort of a human-made element, a sense of the built environment, whether that is a pole or the corner of a building or something that will punctuate the view or block the view, block a more romanticized view. In the city, that was kind of built in, is my feeling, and it's very hard to find a big open sweeping expanse in the city. So this is why it was, a place that he could continue to be excited by in his paintings. So many dynamic compositions just from the buildings that are there. And outside the city, he was almost looking for those places where there was a dynamic between the built environment and nature.
Yeah, I love how you talk about the intrusions of that built environment and these landscapes. You're not expecting to see it, but Hopper always gravitates toward that. So, okay, thank you so much, Kim. Thank you for the questions, for your answers, and I hope everyone will join us also at our exhibition, Edward Hopper's New York.
And next week on part 2 of Hopper on Paper.
Yes, part 2. Come back to us.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us.